Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm also, like she said, I'm from New Jersey, so I can really project if necessary. But thank you so much for coming out and sharing your Saturday with me. And to Blue Sky for hosting me and my work. It's really an honor and to be in such good company with Donna talking here is really special. This is my first time in Portland, and I feel like it's just such a unique opportunity to be able to see new places because of my work being shown in them. And my mom got to travel with me this time, so it's great. It's all great to be here to be able to share some of my work and research. I'm going to talk about the project in that space behind us here, but before that I wanted to just give a bit of background to some work and some research that predates this exhibition and really informs where Kavana arose from. And then I'll take some questions at the end if there are any. It's about 20 minutes. Sound okay? Great. So I want to start with kind of an intimate story with you all, if that's okay. My mom believes that her late mother visits us intermittently in the form of a ladybug. I have no idea where her theory stems from, and admittedly, when she first kind of shared this notion with me, my first thought was mostly wondering if Jews even have thoughts on reincarnation in general. Turns out they do. Kabbalah is called Eber, in which a deceased soul temporarily impregnates a living soul. I don't know if my mom knows consciously about this theory, but in any case, she told me about it about a year and a half ago, and truthfully, I forgot about it until last month. I was having a conversation with another Jewish woman in my studio, an artist, talking about my work. I don't really remember specifically what the conversation was, something loosely about photography and time repeating itself through Jewish experience, and I remember my ideas were just feeling very heard and understood, and suddenly she goes, whoa, 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 hang on. A ladybug just appeared in your hair. And I still didn't remember my mom's ladybug theory in this moment, honestly, even though it literally hit me right on the head. But my studio guest had the good sense to photograph this instance, and when I was looking at this image later that afternoon, I was reminded of my mom and of her mom and of Eber, this impregnation of one soul by another, creating this constant interconnected narrative. And I wanted to start off with this story because so many of my projects explore ideas of the body, of family lineage, and of Jewish storytelling. And I think a lot of this stems from a self-portrait project with my mom that we've been working on over the last 5 years called Indoor Voices. I initiated this project because of my interest in womanhood, in performative feminine behavior, and in how learned action is carried down from mother to daughter. We've continued to make these photographs every time we're together, and it's become a pretty intimate staple of our lives in the way that we share our time. I think this idea of building our memories photographically as they happened in real time and real life, both inside and outside of the frame, manifests its own form of storytelling. And though this work primarily takes place in my childhood home, which is very much a real space, of course, with its own weight and history, there's an aspect of this work that's constructed here, usually in the details. Inside the spaces, there's exaggerated motif, a bit of fiction, a bit of performance. I make use of these small fictions to veil our photographic world in a thin layer of composure that I think mirrors being women outside of the frame pretty accurately. I think, too, that this arranged nature encourages my mom and I to use this space as a healing space to be able to tell stories. Particularly in the time frame of this image here, made in 2017, when my grandmother, my mom's mom, our impregnated ladybug, was dying of cancer after a long health struggle. My mom and I made some pretty critical therapeutic work during the year after her death, and in these works of the time, a balance started to develop between the memory of the portrayed and the photographic portrayal of a story itself. And this balance, this sort of oscillation between action and remembered action, became central interest for both Indoor Voices, as it still continues today, as well as the work that's in that room back there, a project about Judaic folklore and performing Jewish memory. At the time that new work started to manifest, I had just moved to Richmond for my master's at Virginia Commonwealth University, my MFA in photography. But physically and mentally, I was often traveling elsewhere, returning home to New Jersey when I could. My family and I spent a lot of time clearing out my grandma's closets, getting lost in documents of her memory. We found important handwritten notes describing her time as a Holocaust refugee seeking asylum in Cuba. Beforehand, I didn't know too much about the specifics. We also found notes that seemingly described nothing at all, possible descriptions of gifts and objects long past their physicality. We found photographs of her after she immigrated to America, then with my mom as a child, then with my mom pregnant with me, and onward. And through this mess of dust and hoarder-type storage, I couldn't help but keep probing and deciphering, keeping a firm grip on objects that nodded towards an answer to whatever my digging was asking. Notably, there was a lot of Judaica found. Hebrew necklaces, Kiddush cups, artwork, some bestowed specifically to me and some kind of found under the floor. My heirlooms of her. I started using these objects in my work, specifically this image here using a chai necklace, a Hebrew symbol of life, perhaps as a form of healing and sharing in the same way that indoor voices also brings me solace. The Judaica felt like the key here, an active connection to my grandmother, my past, and a connection to myself, my future. There's a concept heavily involved in Jewish cultural life called collective memory, the idea that all Jews by mandate share a past by repeating stories, performing rituals, passing down heirlooms. I started thinking more about these inheritances and how they expand beyond my immediate bloodline and contribute to this idea of collective memory. And I began to consider physical Judaic objects, how they were used, how memory manifests in them through repeated notions like a rhythm. As I began thinking about what forms a sense of memory that spans generations, the work started to flow past my own family, past self-portraiture, and into a stream of collective community. And I think, a lot like aspects of indoor voices, there's something intimately female about the act of passing down. So I started thinking about this new body of work at a few different intersections, considering Jewish ritual, the way we interpret and perform them, and the ways in which using such Judaica in imagery is perpetuating these ideas of collective memory. I wanted the rituals to become more activated in the spaces they were being photographed in, so I started incorporating, and at other times completely ignoring, the ancestral connotations of the objects. Specifically here in this image, I was thinking about pomegranates and their association with potential, as they're commonly used to tell stories of both fertility and of good Jewish deeds. The amount of mitzvot, Jewish commandments, is the same number evidently, as of the number of seeds in a pomegranate, 613. I was considering this connotation of fruitfulness and anxious potential and the weight that shoulders on a woman's back. With this activated interpretation and usage of artifacts, I found that they were starting to reclaim stories of their own. And by they, I mean the images themselves. It feels like a combination of these intersections, of ritual symbols, of constant performance, of memory, all sound like whispers rising to a cohesive chant. In this image here, my research at the time was hyper-focused on death rituals, specifically a cleansing process called tahara, in which the body of the recently deceased is washed before burial. I read this incredible fiction novel by Michelle Brofman called Washing the Dead, highly recommended, about both the ritual itself and the healing aspect of performing it. And then after letting this more formal research and this fiction narrative sink into my skin, I looked at this dead beetle from my back porch because it was commanding my attention, and that's where the root of this image lies. It's as much about the ritual as it is about sort of the translation of the ritual, the steps in between. Photographs in this project in this way are not only addressing the historical significance of certain actions, but using them as a source, a springboard, to initiate present-day stories. So on this note, I got to thinking about stories, specifically Jewish folklore and its consistent structural components, how such stories are told. And a note here, by using the umbrella term of folklore in the context of this talk and my work kind of at large, I'm talking about the body of stories, legends, rituals, objects, anything attached to perpetuating Jewish culture and their varying interpretations. I was looking for patterns within that, something concrete to point to and say, this is what makes this narrative a Jewish one. Sorry, I keep hitting the table. I started this research by reaching backwards, looking into ancient folkloric texts. How femme characters are historically portrayed in these stories, if they're present at all. Unsettled women are often cast off as demons, a threat to mankind and Jewish peoplehood. There's a sexually charged, deviant, baby-stealing Lilith, a chaotic, possessive spirit called a. On the other hand, obedient women are often silent, even when they're the story's heroine. I'm interested, too, in the way these stories are told, in spoken folklore and Yiddish theater, as well as written Talmudic and Midrashic texts, often referred to kind of under the umbrella as Agada literature. The narrative appears to be written in real life and in the concrete, but there's usually a presence, be it a symbol or an event or whatnot, that kind of tilts the story off kilter and opens up these pathways for tangled interpretation. I'm really interested in the complicated nature of such a story, how it can have varying interpretations that reach different moral conclusions and applications, and that multiple answer is really quite Jewish. It does appear, however, that generally Jewish feminist thought falls into two camps, by either being adaptive or subversive of what one inherits. Quoting Amy Milligan here, who's a wonderful scholar of Jewish feminist folklore, when describing different interpretations of Judaica, she says, many feminist approaches to religion eliminate, replace, and render patriarchal religious symbols egalitarian. In contrast, folklore of the body centralizes the narratives of women who use patriarchal symbols, allowing feminists to reform from within the masculine structures they've inherited by utilizing their bodies as they dismantle the larger symbol. While this acceptance of the traditional or the religious may initially seem at odds with feminist thought, it represents a progressive understanding of how the bodies of women become the literal intersecting point of contemporary identity politics. I.e., you can either embrace the symbols you've inherited from your ancestors, or you can subvert the traditional symbols. Either way, it's engagement. And I like to explore both of these veins in my work. I'm not entirely sure personally which way I view is more applicable or correct to me, so I explore both. For example, these two images being shown. The image on the left is made in a mikveh, a bath in which traditionally Orthodox cisgendered married women immerse after their period to be ritually cleansed. And you know, this is a loaded statement, because if you're unfamiliar with mikveh immersions, I don't want you to walk away from this talk under the impression that it's strictly a ritual about body purification. It's often incredibly spiritual, and there's a lot of different opinions about it, but it's immensely private. But after a lot of research, I traveled to Mayan Chaim in Massachusetts. It's a mikveh that's really expanded the usage of the ritual space to foster new uses for the contemporary Jewish community of any background, like healing immersions following an illness, celebration immersions for a birthday, etc. Here they let me photograph my cousin in a birthday immersion, utilizing this inherited space in a way that feels Jewishly engaged to them. In contrast, the image on the right is more so talking about subversion, specifically here of historically masculine garb. Included in the image is tzitzit, the shirt with the threads, and a kippah worn on the back of the head. This is clothing understood to be physical evidence, public evidence, of a cisgendered man's commitment to Judaism and its commandments. And anyone outside of that canon reclaiming religious garb through wearing it, there's once again this utilization of a symbol in a way that feels Jewishly engaged to the person doing it, whether that be subversive or adaptive, public or private. These interpretations can be considered commentary itself. I'm really interested in this varying commentary, especially as it regards the story itself. Because there are so many valid interpretations of folklore, Jewish thought in this context proposes the idea that varying interpretation of a story is as significant to study and understand and perpetuate as the actual story itself. And this constant interpretation and performance of a story leads me back from this actually quite long tangent to once again kind of propose this question of what makes Jewish folklore Jewish? And furthermore, what do these portrayed narratives look like photographically? I began looking for answers here, not only in story and ritual themselves, but in the expanded interpretations of meaning. There are a few concrete examples that point to several larger interrelated themes which appear to be central in any anthropological attempt to come to grips with the complicated features of Judaic culture. One theme here is the centrality of story. While other great traditions, of course, also relate themselves to sacred text, the widespread influence of text, story, and action in daily life has been a notable feature of Jewish culture historically. Secondly, there's the question of performance. the realization and the interpretation of ancestral patterns tied in complex, multiplex strands, an actual practice. Jewish story, history, and memory are subjects around which we tend to revolve. We carry within us this vast chronicle of our beginnings, of our diaspora, our persecution. It seems essential within Jewish culture to memorialize history by carrying it with us again and again through a yearly ritual repetition of stories and traditions. I was thinking about these retellings when I made this image, a mother and daughter sharing both this concrete gaze as well as the weight of their shared recurring history that their bodies carry. I started exploring the idea that in both my photographic work and in Jewish ritual at large, really, using the body as a tool to be centralized in Jewish action can be tied to enhancing a fluid sense of memory that's not fixed in time or space, and therefore participates in collective memory. By photographically engaging Judaism in a way that the enactor deems a true iteration of storytelling, we apply ritual, Judaica, and individualism within a broad range of collective memory. This enhancement centers the body, it emphasizes claimed use of space, and becomes an active participant in the interpretation and performance of folklore. If the way that we understand Jewish ritual is through enactment over time by family and environment, photographing the body in relation to the themes and motifs of Jewish story in various ways allows us to kind of infinitely engage with the folklore, to interpret meaning, and to allow the image itself to become a narrative heirloom. Not to mention the strange way that time itself is presented in Hebrew, simultaneously in the past and future. While I've mentioned that history and remembrance play a central role in our understanding of Jewish identity and the way it's portrayed, time and space appear to be viewed very differently. The borderline stereotypes of being people of the book and wandering Jews and whatnot actually kind of presents this really interesting concept of folklore itself being this sort of portable homeland, accessible wherever one can engage with their body. It conveys that a central tenet of the Jewish experience outside of the contemporary Israeli one is one of profound displacement, existence in roaming diasporas, lacking a proper attachment to a physical place, with a tendency to privilege time and action and history itself over place and space. I love this secondary approach to space, it's fascinating. Because no place is a given, we prioritize time in the way that we fill it. Jewish action, and henceforth these photographs that are portraying Jewish action, is cemented not because of where it takes place, but because of what occurs in a more ritualistic timeline. This approach to the portrayal of time and its emphasis on repetition allows for this constant centering of the Jewish body, and that constant stream of interpretation is engaged. The images are positioning themselves in the past as memories, in the present as stories being told, and in the future as rituals to interpret and repeat, on and on. What comes to be, therefore, has always been, and we as Jews hold the opportunity to contribute a narrative to this. This continuous form of interpreting and enacting and sharing helps perpetuate a collective memory, and I want images in this project as it continues to contribute to this long chain of storytelling. In this sense, the photographs become heirlooms themselves, tales to pass on, actions to repeat. They're the narratives in which Jewish memories are the center, using our bodies to exist in the past, in the present, in the future, with our rituals, our symbols, our lives. Treating images in this body of work as stories with individual bloodlines of their own, I want to explore more deeply these notions of memory, of Judaica, of image making. I want to keep developing work that not only prompts what the image feels like as a photograph, but asks, what does it remember like? That's it. Thank you. Questions?
I have a question about the image on the right there. I've never seen that quote. And then it says mistranslation, so I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, so this was one of the objects found in this archive, and the first word is ahava, which is love, and the second word is kind of, I think it's something with the way that the gold had to be connected, because it kind of means you, but it almost, I can't quite tell what the letter is. Sorry, I don't know if that's my mic or...
No, I think just turning the second one. That's fine. That was better, yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
No, I don't Wait.
Sorry.
Just turn them off.
Yeah, I can just.
Yeah.
Am I heard?
Yes.
Cool. Maybe I'll just. There we go. And the last word is le'olam, so it either means the world or prayer, depending on the context. So this kind of grouping together doesn't really mean anything, but it also means a bunch of different things. So when I read it for the first time, I thought it meant like I will love you forever, but it doesn't quite make sense. So I asked a bunch of native Israeli or native Hebrew speakers, and they all gave me like a bunch of different answers, and I thought that was really interesting. And two people said I love the world with you was what that meant, and then other people said like I will love you forever, my love is with you forever. So I just think that's kind of really fascinating that there are different translations of these same images. And if it is a mistranslation, I think that's okay, because I think that kind of multiple answers, it makes kind of perfect sense here. So I don't really know what it actually means, but I think I love the world with you is kind of really romantic.
Yeah. And then I was just curious if you are willing to share what sort of home were you raised in terms of being an observant Jew or not observant Jew, and what is your practice now?
So I was raised Reform, and I had a bat mitzvah, and I did birthright, and I did more of the sort of stereotypical, more secular Jewish things. And then I moved to the South. And I would have, and I don't think secular is really an accurate word to say, but I think I became a lot more observant when I moved to the South, and anything that's not Christ-centric is very, you're kind of hyper-aware of all of those actions. So it's interesting, like I started keeping Shabbat more now that I live in the South, and I have just gotten very deep into the wormholes of research. Of specific ideas, and I think that that's been really fascinating, and the older I get, the more interested in it I get. I think when I was younger, I was as interested in the more mystical aspects of it. I feel the most observant when I'm learning something new, if that makes sense. Whoa. Any other questions?
Could you talk about your process in terms of how you chose to interpret any given ritual that you depict?
Yeah, and I think, let's see. I think I talk a little bit about, I talk pretty extensively about these two, but then especially like in terms of this, where I was, like I said, I was doing research at the time about this death ritual that was about cleansing and water, and kind of honoring every life and having that action be recorded. I knew it was kind of like brewing for a long time, but I think the more that I work on this project, it's more about allowing time between the research into like what the roots are in specific ritual, and allowing steps of translation, and allowing like a slower burn of a process, and maybe even having the work be a couple of steps removed from pointing to a specific ritual, if that makes sense, or pointing to a specific story. I think it's as much about absorbing sort of the takeaways from these rituals or from such stories, and making images from that, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wait, sorry.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So you named it Kavana, the group, and yet it's kind of an exploration about your family history. So how do you relate the name Kavana to your autobiographical statement?
Well, I think that I think it's very connected in the way that these objects were always there. And so that is kind of the kiva of that entire process, whereas the kavana is more of the spiritual connection that takes place inside of the more structured ritual. And it doesn't always exist, but repeating the rituals kind of allows for the space to exist. It allows for that emotional connection, and when it does happen, it's because you are repeating these things. And I think that's how it connects, is that it is based. It's not ritual specific in its emotional clarity and impact, but when it happens, it's because of that root. Yeah.
What is the definition of Kavana, or what does it mean?
So there's two parts of ritual. So there's kiva, which is the more like structural component, like you light Shabbat candles at sundown on a Friday night. And then Kavana is more of the spiritual connection when you're actually doing that. It's more of the intangible. And sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. I think to say that something is equally special every single time it's performed is, I personally don't feel that way, and I don't know if that's even really meant to be that way. But I think it's more so repeating these actions opens up that space for deeper connection.
Okay.
Thank you.